The vast halls of the Xilari Imperial Palace stretched high into the sky, carved from dark blue stone that shimmered under artificial lights. The palace was a symbol of power, a place where many civilizations had come to bow before the might of the Xilari Empire. But today, a human had arrived, not to bow, but to negotiate. Ambassador James Carter walked through the long corridor, his boots making a steady sound against the polished floor. He did not flinch under the watchful eyes of Xilari guards standing along the sides. Each guard wore shining silver armor and held a spear-like weapon that hummed with energy. Their eyes, bright yellow and emotionless, followed him as he moved forward. James had heard many things about the Xilari. Some called them ruthless conquerors, others described them as cold and calculating. But he did not come to this place to fear them. He came to secure peace between humanity and the Xilari Empire. At the end of the corridor, two massive doors opened. Inside was the Grand Imperial Chamber, where the most powerful Xilari leaders sat in a circular formation. In the center of them was Princess Vayana, daughter of the Emperor. She was tall, with violet skin that shimmered like metal under the golden lights. Her long silver hair was braided, resting over her shoulders, and her deep green eyes studied James with quiet curiosity. James took a deep breath. He was ready for this. A tall Xilari, dressed in a black ceremonial robe, stepped forward. His name was Chancellor Varian, one of the Emperor's closest advisors. He spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "Ambassador Carter, you stand before the Imperial Court of the Xilari Empire. Do you understand the significance of this moment?" James gave a polite nod. "I do." Varian's sharp eyes narrowed. "Humanity is young among the stars. You do not have great fleets or powerful weapons like us. Why should we consider peace with your kind when we could take what we want?" The air grew tense. James could feel the weight of many eyes on him. He could hear the low whispers among the Xilari nobles, all waiting for his response. But he did not let fear control him. Instead, he smiled slightly. "With all due respect, Chancellor, I believe peace is more valuable than conquest. War destroys, but alliances build. Humanity may not have the strength of the Xilari, but we have something just as powerful: determination. We do not give up, even when the odds are against us. That is why we are here. That is why we fight for peace." The chamber grew silent. Princess Vayana tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, from the left side of the room, a deep voice echoed. "Words are easy, human," said General Korath, one of the Empire's highest military leaders. He was a massive Xilari, his armor decorated with the symbols of many battles. His golden eyes glowed with challenge. But the battlefield does not care for words. It only respects strength. James met his gaze without hesitation. "Then let us prove our strength through unity, not war." Some of the nobles scoffed. Others murmured among themselves. The Xilari had built their empire through conquest, not alliances. The idea of peace with a younger race like humanity was strange to them. Princess Vayana finally spoke, her voice calm but filled with authority. "Ambassador Carter, I have read reports of your people. Your history is filled with war and conflict. Yet, here you stand, asking for peace." She leaned forward slightly. "Why?" James held her gaze. "Because we have learned from our past. We have fought enough wars to know they only bring destruction. We are not perfect, but we strive to be better." Vayana studied him for a moment before sitting back in her seat. "Interesting." Varian cleared his throat. "The Emperor has granted you the chance to speak, but it is not enough to convince us. There will be trials." James raised an eyebrow. "Trials?" Korath grinned, revealing sharp teeth. "Yes, human. You will be tested. Your words must be backed by action. Only then will we decide if humanity is worthy of peace." James took a deep breath. He had expected challenges, but this was something else. Still, he would not back down. "I accept," he said firmly. Vayana's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. curiosity, perhaps even admiration. She had never seen a human before, but this one was not what she had expected. The meeting was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. James Carter had stepped into the lion's den, and now he had to prove that humanity was not prey, but an equal. The hall where the negotiations took place was vast and intimidating. High walls of polished stone reflected the golden glow of the hovering lanterns, and long banners of the Scifi Empire hung proudly from the ceiling. The room was filled with alien nobles, their cold yellow eyes fixed on Ambassador James Carter. At the center of it all, sitting on an elevated throne, was Princess Vayana. She watched James with a calm, unreadable expression. Chancellor Varian stepped forward, his black ceremonial robe swaying as he addressed the gathering. "The human ambassador has accepted our trials," he announced. His voice echoed in the grand chamber. "As is tradition, we shall test his words. He claims that humanity is strong, that they deserve peace instead of war. But strength is not proven through empty speech. Strength is shown through action." A deep murmur spread through the nobles, some nodding in approval, others watching James with doubt. Varian turned his gaze to James. "The first trial shall be one of words, a battle of minds, not weapons." James raised an eyebrow. "A debate. Call it what you will," Varian said. "But if you fail to defend your cause, you will be seen as weak, and the Scifi do not make peace with the weak." James inhaled slowly. He had been in tough negotiations before, but this was different. The Scifi were a proud and powerful race, and many of them still saw humans as insignificant. If he failed to prove humanity's strength, this peace would be lost. A sharp metallic sound echoed as General Korath stood from his seat. He was larger than any Scifi in the room, his deep violet armor decorated with the symbols of countless battles. He smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "I shall be his opponent," Korath declared. "Let us see if this human's tongue is as strong as his spirit." James felt the weight of the challenge, but did not waver. He gave a respectful nod. "Then let's begin." The trial begins. James and Korath stood at the center of the chamber, facing each other. Varian raised his hand. "The question is simple," he said. "Why should the Scifi seek peace with humanity instead of conquering them?" Korath spoke first. His voice was loud and commanding. "The Scifi have built their empire through strength. We have conquered countless worlds, bringing order where there was only chaos. The weak fall and the strong rule. That is the law of the universe. And yet this human stands before us, claiming that peace is the better path." He turned his golden eyes toward James. "Tell us, human, why should we go against the natural order?" A hush fell over the chamber. Many of the nobles nodded at Korath's words. The Scifi had always believed in conquest. It was in their blood. James remained calm. He had expected this argument. He stepped forward and spoke clearly. "Strength is not just about conquest," he said. "It is about survival. The Scifi are strong, yes, but even the strongest empire can fall if it does not evolve." Korath's eyes narrowed. "Explain." James gestured to the gathered nobles. "Your empire has expanded for centuries, taking world after world. But history has shown us that no empire can survive forever through war alone. The more enemies you make, the more fragile your rule becomes." He paused for a moment before adding, "Even the mightiest tree will fall if too many axes strike it at once." Some nobles exchanged glances. A few whispered among themselves. Princess Vayana tilted her head slightly, intrigued. Korath, however, was not so easily moved. He smirked. "And you believe humanity can offer us survival?" "Yes," James said without hesitation. "Because humans understand struggle. We have faced war, famine, destruction, and we have survived. Not because we were the strongest, but because we adapted. We learned to stand together when the world was against us. That is true strength." Korath crossed his arms, So you claim that alliances are stronger than war? I do, James said. You could crush humanity today. Your empire could wipe us out. But in doings, oh, you would create new enemies, races who would fear and hate you. But if you choose peace, if you choose to stand with us instead of against us, the Xilari will not just be strong, you will be unstoppable. Silence. For the first time, Korath had no immediate reply. The chamber was filled with quiet murmurs. Some nobles nodded in agreement. Others frowned, struggling to accept the human's logic. Then, to everyone's surprise, Princess Vayana spoke. There is wisdom in your words, Ambassador Carter, she said. Her voice was calm, yet there was something new in it, something almost impressed. The Xilari have never needed allies before, but times change. Korath clenched his jaw but did not argue. Varian stepped forward. The first trial is complete. He turned to the gathered nobles. What say you? One by one, voices spoke out. Some still doubted, but many acknowledged James's strength, not through weapons, but through sheer determination. Finally, Varian nodded. The human has passed the first test. James let out a slow breath, but he did not relax. This was only the beginning. Vayana's green eyes studied him carefully. She had expected a weak diplomat, one who would beg for peace. Instead, she had found someone who stood his ground, someone who believed in his people. She did not say it aloud, but for the first time, she felt something unexpected toward this human: respect. But the trials were not over, and the next one would be far more dangerous. The halls of the Xilari Imperial Palace were quieter than usual as Ambassador James Carter walked through them. The first trial had ended, and against all odds, he had passed. He had stood against General Korath in a battle of words and had proven that humanity was not weak. But James knew one thing: this was far from over. The Xilari were a race of warriors and conquerors. A single debate would not change their nature. The next trial would likely be more dangerous, perhaps even physical. James had expected this. What he hadn't expected, however, was the feeling that someone was watching him. As he walked through the long corridors, he noticed the guards standing a little too still. The air felt heavier, the silence unnatural. Something wasn't right. Ambassador Carter, a voice called. James turned to see Princess Vayana approaching. She was still dressed in her elegant ceremonial robes, her silver hair flowing behind her as she walked with the grace of a leader. Her green eyes studied him carefully, as if searching for something. "You handled yourself well today," she said, stopping in front of him. "Many of the nobles still doubt you, but some are beginning to listen." James gave a small nod. "I expected resistance. Changing minds isn't easy." Vayana tilted her head slightly. "You seem calm for someone walking into the unknown." James smiled. "Humans have always walked into the unknown. It's how we survive." A flicker of amusement crossed her face, but it was gone in an instant. She glanced at the guards standing nearby, then lowered her voice. "Be careful, Ambassador. There are those who do not want this peace to happen." James frowned. "I suspected as much." "There are whispers," she continued. "A faction within the military sees peace as a weakness. They believe war is the only way forward. And General Korath is not the only one who shares this belief." James folded his arms. "You think they'll try something?" Vayana hesitated, then said, "I am certain of it. The assassination attempt." That night, James could not sleep. His mind kept replaying Vayana's warning. He had faced threats before, but this was different. If someone wanted to sabotage the peace talks, removing him would be the easiest way. As he stood by the window of his guest chamber, looking out at the alien city below, he heard a soft noise behind him. A whisper of movement. Instinct kicked in. James turned just as a shadow leaped toward him, a blade flashing in the dim light. He ducked. The blade missed him by inches, slashing through the air where his neck had been. Without thinking, James threw himself forward, crashing into the attacker. They both hit the ground hard. James struggled, feeling the strength of his opponent. The attacker was fast, trained, and strong. Definitely AXE. Lhari warrior. The assassin recovered quickly, kicking James backward. James hit the wall, pain shooting up his back. The assassin lunged again. This time, James grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting it sharply. The blade clattered to the floor. The assassin growled, throwing a punch that James barely dodged. James knew he couldn't win in a straight fight. He was strong, but the Xilari were naturally superior in physical combat. He needed a different approach. Thinking fast, he grabbed a nearby lamp and smashed it into the attacker's face. The Xilari stumbled, disoriented. James didn't hesitate. He tackled the assassin, slamming them into the floor and pinning them down. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The assassin struggled but did not answer. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and several guards rushed in, weapons drawn. Behind them stood Princess Vayana, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene. James released the assassin and stepped back as the guards restrained the attacker. Vayana approached slowly. "Are you hurt?" James shook his head, breathing heavily. "I'll live." One of the guards removed the assassin's mask, revealing the auxiliary soldier with the mark of the war faction, a group of military leaders who opposed peace. Vayana's expression darkened. "So it has begun." James looked at her. "You were right. Someone wants to stop these talks." She nodded, "And they are willing to kill to do it." A shift in trust. The captured assassin was taken away for questioning, but James knew this attack was only the beginning. As he sat in Vayana's private chamber, she poured him a drink, her face unusually serious. "This will not be the last attempt," she said. "The war faction is growing bolder. If they tried to kill you tonight, they will try again." James took the drink, nodding. "So what do we do?" Vayana sighed. "The Emperor must be informed. But more than that, we must find out who is truly behind this. Someone gave the order. Someone powerful." James watched her carefully. She was different from the other Xilari nobles. She did not see humanity as weak. He could sense that she truly wanted peace, but she was trapped in a dangerous political game. "You believe in this treaty, don't you?" James asked. Vayana met his gaze. "I do." James leaned forward. "Then let's make sure it happens." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Vayana smiled. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. "You are not what I expected, Ambassador Carter." James chuckled. "I get that a lot." But deep inside, he knew that the real battle had just begun. If the war faction was willing to assassinate him, then things were more dangerous than he had imagined. And if they wanted to stop him, they were going to have to try a lot harder. The atmosphere in the Xilari Imperial Palace was heavy with tension. Word of the assassination attempt on Ambassador James Carter had spread among the nobles, causing a storm of whispers and speculation. Some believed the attack was proof that humanity was weak, while others saw it as a sign that not everyone in the empire wanted war. But James knew one thing: this was only the beginning. Now, as he stood in the grand chamber once more, he felt the weight of 100 eyes upon him. The trial of words was over. Now, the Xilari would test something else. Princess Vayana sat in her usual place, her expression calm, but James could tell she was troubled. General Korev, however, looked more confident than ever. Chancellor Varian stepped forward and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "The second trial shall now begin. It will not be a battle of words, but a test of courage and survival. Since the dawn of our empire, the trial of strength has determined who is truly worthy to stand beside us." He turned to James. "Do you accept, human?" James knew he had no choice. If he refused, the Xilari would see humanity as weak, and weakness would mean the end of these peace talks. "I accept," he said firmly. A deep murmur spread through the room. Some of the Xilari nobles exchanged amused glances. They did not believe a human could survive what was coming. Korath smirked. Let us see if your spirit is as strong as your words. The arena of the beasts. James was led through a long corridor deep beneath the palace. The air was damp, the walls rough and ancient. 2 guards flanked him as he walked toward a massive gate. Vayana walked beside him, her face unreadable. The trial of strength is an ancient custom, she explained. For centuries, warriors have proven themselves here. James glanced at her. And what exactly am I fighting? Vayana hesitated. A Rathgor. James frowned. That sounds big. It is. Before he could ask more, the guard stopped. One of them pulled a large lever, and the metal gate slowly began to rise. A deafening roar shook the ground. James stepped forward into a massive arena, its stone walls covered in scratches and scorch marks. Above him, hundreds of Scifi nobles watched from their seats. The air was thick with anticipation. And across the arena, behind another heavy gate, something massive moved. Boom, boom, boom. The ground trembled with each step. Then, with a loud crash, the second gate burst open, and the Rathgor emerged. James's eyes widened. The creature was at least 4 meters tall, covered in thick, armored scales. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto him, and its sharp claws scraped against the ground as it let out another deafening roar. The crowd cheered, excited for the battle to begin. Vayana, watching from above, felt something she didn't expect: worry. She had read reports about humans being resourceful, but could one truly survive against a Rathgor? James took a deep breath. He had fought in dangerous situations before, but this was different. He had no weapon, no armor, just his instincts. The Rathgor charged. The battle for survival. James dove to the side just as the creature's massive claws slammed into the ground where he had stood. Dust and debris flew into the air. Fast, he muttered, rolling to his feet. The Rathgor turned, growling, before swinging its powerful tail at him. James barely managed to jump over it, but the shockwave from the impact sent him stumbling. He couldn't fight this thing with brute strength. It was too big, too strong. He needed a plan. Looking around, he saw that the arena floor had scattered weapons from past battles: spears, broken shields, even pieces of armor. James sprinted toward a fallen spear just as the Rathgor lunged again. He grabbed the weapon and turned, barely blocking the creature's claws. The impact nearly sent him flying, but he held his ground. The crowd roared with excitement. Korath, watching from above, chuckled. He is fast, I'll give him that. But he won't last long. Vayana remained silent, gripping the railing as she watched. James dodged another strike, then used the spear to stab at the creature's leg. The tip barely pierced the thick scales, but it was enough to make the Rathgor stumble for a moment. A plan formed in his mind. He couldn't kill the Rathgor in a straight fight, but he didn't have to. He just had to win. James ran toward a broken column near the edge of the arena. The Rathgor, enraged, charged after him. At the last second, James leaped aside, and the massive beast slammed into the stone pillar. The force of the impact sent cracks running up the structure. The Rathgor shook its head, dazed. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed another spear and aimed for the creature's eye. With all his strength, he threw the weapon. The spear pierced the Rathgor's eye, and the beast roared in pain, stumbling backward. The cracked pillar collapsed, bringing down tons of stone right on top of the Rathgor. Boom! Dust filled the arena. The crowd went silent. Then, as the dust settled, James stood, bruised, exhausted, but alive. The Rathgor lay beneath the rubble, defeated. Silence. Then cheers erupted. Some Scifi nobles looked impressed. Others looked shocked. Vayana let out a slow breath. Korath's smirk faded slightly. He had expected the human to fail. Chancellor Varian rose from his seat. The human has completed the trial, he announced. He has proven his strength, not through brute force, but through intelligence and survival. James looked up at the nobles, then at Vaiana. She nodded slightly, a hint of respect in her expression. He had passed another test, but he knew the hardest trial was still to come. And somewhere in the shadows, the enemies of peace were watching, waiting for their next move. James Carter sat in his chamber, wrapping a bandage around his arm, where the Rathgor's claw had grazed him. His body ached from the battle, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had passed the trial of strength, proving that humans were not weak. Yet he knew this was still far from over. There was a knock at the door. Before he could answer, the door slid open, and Princess Vaiana stepped inside. She was dressed in a dark cloak instead of her usual ceremonial robes. Her silver hair was tied back, and her green eyes carried an urgency that made James sit up straight. "You should rest," she said, closing the door behind her. James smirked. "I'll rest when the treaty is signed." Vaiana sighed, then stepped closer. "You impressed many today, Ambassador. The way you defeated the Rathgor without brute strength. That is something the Xilari nobles did not expect." "But," James raised an eyebrow, "but you have also made enemies." She lowered her voice. "The war faction does not take failure lightly. The more you prove yourself, the more desperate they will become." James leaned back, thinking. He had suspected as much. Then they'll try again. Vaiana hesitated, then said, "Yes, and this time they may not rely on assassins or beasts." James frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "There is a meeting tonight. The high nobles will discuss the final trial, one that will determine whether your people will be accepted as allies or as future enemies." James nodded. "Then I need to be there." Vaiana shook her head. "No. The war faction controls many seats in the council. They will not allow you to speak." James crossed his arms. "Then how do we stop them from sabotaging the peace talks?" Vaiana's eyes flickered with hesitation, then resolve. "We find out what they're planning, before they can act." The secret meeting. That night, James followed Vaiana through the dark corridors of the palace. She led him to a hidden passage behind the throne room, where the council of nobles was gathering. Peering through a small opening in the stone wall, James saw a grand chamber filled with high-ranking Xilari. Some of them were the same nobles who had watched him fight in the arena. Others were warriors, dressed in heavy armor. At the center of the room stood General Korath. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. "The human has passed 2 trials," Korath said, his expression unreadable. "But we must ask ourselves, do we truly wish to welcome such a species into our empire?" A noble with dark red skin stood up. "He has shown intelligence, strength, and courage. These are traits we value, are they not?" Korath's eyes flashed. "Perhaps. But what of their true intentions? Humans are an ambitious species. They claim they want peace, but what if they only seek knowledge of our weaknesses?" A murmur spread through the room. Some of the nobles nodded in agreement. James clenched his fists. This was exactly what he had feared. Korath was using doubt to poison the negotiations. Another noble, a female warrior with sharp horns, stood. "Then let the final trial be the true test," she said. "A trial not of words or battle, but of loyalty." Korath smiled. "Yes, let us see if the human is willing to bleed for our empire." James narrowed his eyes. Something about the way Korath said those words made his instincts flare with warning. Vaiana tensed beside him. "They are planning something," she whispered. "Something dangerous." James took a deep breath. "Then we need to be ready." A dangerous proposition. The next morning, James was summoned before the council. The grand chamber was filled once more, but this time, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Chancellor Varian stood at the center, his gaze heavy. "Ambassador Carter, you have passed 2 trials, but the final test is upon you." James kept his expression neutral. "And what is this final trial?" Korath stepped forward, his face unreadable. "A mission," he said. "A task that will prove humanity's true loyalty to the Scifi Empire." James raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Korath continued, "Our empire has many enemies. There is a faction of rebels who have defied the Emperor's rule. They are hiding on a distant moon." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you wish to prove that your species is truly worthy of being our allies, you will eliminate them." Silence filled the room. James frowned. "You're asking me to kill for your empire." Varian cleared his throat. "The rebels are traitors, criminals. If humanity wishes to stand beside us, then you must be willing to act in our interests." James felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. He knew what this was. This wasn't a test of strength or survival. This was a test of obedience. If he refused, they would call humanity weak. If he agreed, he would become a pawn in their wars. Vayana, standing among the nobles, watched him carefully. She could see the trap that had been set for him. James took a slow breath. His mind raced through his options. He couldn't refuse outright. That would end the negotiations, but he couldn't agree either. So he did what humans did best. He improvised. "I accept," James said. A murmur of approval spread through the room. "But," he continued, raising his voice, "if I am to do this, I must do it my way. I will not act as an executioner. I will handle this mission as a diplomat." Korath's expression darkened. "Diplomacy will not work on traitors." James met his gaze without fear. "Then let me fail." He smirked slightly. "Unless, of course, you're afraid a human will succeed where your warriors have not." The chamber fell silent. Then, slowly, Varian nodded. "Very well. You will be given a ship and a squad of Scifi soldiers. Complete the mission, and humanity will have proven its worth." Korath's lips curled in amusement. "Let us see if your words can save you this time, Ambassador." James turned to leave, locking eyes with Vayana. She gave him the slightest nod, a silent message of trust. As he walked out of the chamber, he knew one thing. This mission was supposed to be impossible, and that meant it was the perfect challenge for a human. James Carter stood in the hangar bay, watching as the auxiliary soldiers prepared for departure. The mission had been set. He was to lead an operation against a rebel faction hiding on a distant moon. But he had no intention of massacring anyone. He adjusted his uniform, his mind racing. This was a trap. General Korath had carefully chosen this mission, expecting James to either fail or comply. If he failed, humanity would be seen as weak. If he obeyed, he would become nothing more than a weapon for the Scifi Empire. James refused to let either happen. The team assembles. A squad of 6 Scifi warriors stood before him. Their leader, Commander Talvik, was a tall, scared veteran with piercing blue eyes. "You are in command, human," Talvik said, his voice sharp. "But do not expect us to follow blindly." James nodded. "I don't need blind loyalty. I need results." Talvik narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Behind him, Princess Vayana approached. She was not part of the mission, but she had insisted on being present for the launch. "This is a dangerous path, Ambassador," she said in a low voice. "Korath expects you to fail." James smirked. "Then let's disappoint him." Vayana hesitated, then handed him a small data chip. "Information about the rebels," she whispered. "They are not the mindless killers Korath claims them to be." James took the chip and gave her a grateful nod. Then, turning back to his team, he stepped onto the waiting dropship. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off, heading toward the rebel hideout. The mission had begun. Arrival on the moon. The rebel base was hidden deep inside a canyon, surrounded by jagged cliffs and thick fog. Their ship landed on a rocky outcrop a few miles away, and the auxiliary soldiers moved swiftly, their weapons at the ready. Talvik glanced at James. "We attack at dawn." James shook his head. "No, we talk first." The soldiers exchanged confused glances. They are rebels, one of them scoffed. They do not deserve mercy. James crossed his arms. And yet, here we are, proving we're better than them by slaughtering them. Talvik sighed. If you think they will listen, you are a fool. James didn't argue. Instead, he tapped his comms device and set it to a public frequency. This is Ambassador James Carter of the Terran Federation, he said. I request a meeting with your leader. Silence. Then, after a long pause, a voice crackled through the speakers. Come alone. Talvik stiffened. It's a trap. James smiled. Probably. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed his communicator, adjusted his translator device, and walked into the fog, heading toward the rebel base. The rebel leader. The base was nothing like James had expected. It wasn't a heavily armed fortress. It was a settlement. Families, children, workers. These weren't warriors. They were people simply trying to survive. James was escorted into a makeshift command center where a tall Xilari female stood waiting. She had dark red skin, piercing black eyes, and an aura of authority. I am Commander Salis, she said. You are either very brave or very foolish. James smiled. I hear that a lot. Salis studied him carefully. So, the humans wish to prove themselves by killing us. No, James said firmly. I came here to stop the killing. Salis narrowed her eyes. You expect me to believe that? James placed the data chip on the table. This contains proof that General Korath wants this war. He doesn't care about your crimes. He just needs an excuse to keep fighting. Salis hesitated, then inserted the chip into her console. As she scanned the information, her expression hardened. So it's true, she muttered. James leaned forward. Help me expose Korath, and we can end this war before it begins. Salis looked at him for a long moment. Then she made her decision. You have my support. The betrayal. James returned to the drop site with Salis at his side. But as soon as they stepped out of the fog, blaster fire erupted. James barely had time to react before Salis shoved him aside, drawing her weapon. Talvik and the Xilari soldiers stood with their weapons raised, their faces cold. You have failed the mission, human, Talvik said. You were supposed to eliminate the rebels, not ally with them. James clenched his fists. This was never about loyalty. This was about justice. Talvik's expression didn't change. The council will not see it that way. Before he could give the order to fire, Salis acted. She grabbed James and activated a hidden teleport beacon. In a flash of blue light, they'd vanished. Escape to the truth. James and Salis reappeared inside a small cloaked ship orbiting the moon. Not bad, James muttered, rubbing his head. Salis smirked. I always have a backup plan. James turned toward the cockpit. We need to get back to the palace. Salis frowned. You'll be arrested the moment you arrive. James grinned. Then we better make sure we bring enough evidence with us. He tapped his communicator, sending a secret message to Princess Vayana. The war faction had made their move. Now, it was time for James to make his. The final battle for peace was about to begin. James Carter stood in the cockpit of the cloaked rebel ship, staring at the massive Xilari capital palace in the distance. The towering structure gleamed under the twin moons, its spires reaching toward the stars. It was the heart of the empire, and tonight, it would be the stage for the final battle. Not of weapons, but of truth. Behind him, Commander Salis checked the ship's systems. Are you sure about this, human? She asked. If you fail, both of us will be executed. James smirked. Then I guess we better not fail. He tapped his communicator, sending a signal to Princess Vayana. The message was simple. I'm coming. Be ready. A few seconds later, her response flashed on the screen. Hurry. Korath is making his move. James turned to Salis. It's now or never. Salis nodded and activated the ship's thrusters. The cloaked vessel slipped through the palace's defenses heading straight for the hidden landing bay where Vayana waited. The final confrontation had begun. A dangerous welcome. James and Salis stepped out of the ship, their weapons holstered. Princess Vayana was already there, dressed in royal robes, her expression tense. "You took a great risk coming here," she said. James grinned. "I prefer to think of it as a calculated risk." She sighed. "The council is already gathered. Korath is claiming you betrayed the Empire." James's expression hardened. "Then it's time to prove him wrong." Vayana nodded and led them through the secret corridors of the palace. With every step, James could feel the tension growing. The halls were filled with armed guards, and whispers of his so-called treachery echoed around them. Finally, they'd reached the Grand Council chamber, where the most powerful auxiliary nobles were seated. At the center of the room stood General Korath, his armored figure imposing. As James entered, all eyes turned toward him. "You dare return?" Korath's voice boomed. "You disobeyed the trial, aided the enemy, and now expect us to listen." James stepped forward, unshaken. "I expect you to hear the truth." Korath scoffed. "And what truth is that?" James pulled out the data chip that Vayana had given him earlier, the one containing all the evidence of Korath's schemes. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the hologram, and the entire room was filled with images and recordings of Korath's secret messages. The evidence was clear. He had manipulated the trials, lied about the rebels, and pushed for war to increase his own power. The chamber fell silent. Then murmurs of disbelief spread through the nobles. Some looked at Korath with suspicion. Others looked at James with newfound respect. Korath's face darkened. This means nothing." He slammed his fist on the table. "Humans are still a threat. This so-called ambassador has defied our laws." James held his ground. "I defied you, not the Empire." He turned to the council. "You wanted to test humanity's worth. I proved it, not through bloodshed, but through honor." A noble stood up. "And what of the rebels? What did you do with them?" James glanced at Salis, then back at the council. "I gave them a choice, war or peace. They chose peace." The chamber erupted into chaos. Some nobles shouted in outrage, others in shock. Korath, realizing he was losing control, drew his weapon. "I will not let a human decide our fate," he roared, raising his blaster. But before he could fire, Vayana moved. In a flash, she stepped in front of James, her own royal blade drawn. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "You claim to serve the Empire, Korath, but all you serve is your own ambition." The guards hesitated. Korath looked around, realizing his support was crumbling. With a growl, he turned and fired. But James was faster. He lunged forward, knocking Korath's arm aside just as the blaster discharged. The shot missed by inches, hitting the wall behind them. Before Korath could recover, James delivered a precise strike, sending the general crashing to the ground. Silence filled the room. Then, Chancellor Varian stood. "General Korath," he said, his voice cold, "you are under arrest for treason." The guards seized Korath, dragging him away as he shouted curses. James let out a slow breath. It was over. A new alliance. The council took hours to deliberate, but the outcome was clear. Humanity had proven itself. James stood before the nobles one last time, as Chancellor Varian addressed him. "Ambassador Carter," he said, "you have shown not only strength, but wisdom. You chose diplomacy over war, and because of that, the Empire stands stronger than before." He looked at the council. "Let it be known that from this day forward, humanity shall be recognized as a valued ally of the Scifi Empire." A murmur of agreement swept through the chamber. James smiled. They had done it. Beside him, Vayana gave a small nod. Salis crossed her arms, smirking. As James stepped out of the chamber, he looked up at the night sky. This was only the beginning. Humanity had taken its place among the stars. and for the first time, the universe would see what they were truly capable of.